what we want to do is this is driven out of a desire to help our congregants know each other, and to hear some backstory. And quite frankly, Margot, we picked you for two reasons. One is very practical. You're one of our oldest congregants.
Donna Stern asked me the other day, she said, "Are you the oldest?" I said, "I have no idea, but I'm close to it."
You're close to it. And your story, as much as we may say everybody's story is significant, no question, your story has a unique significance that is so important, dare I say, for the world to know, certainly for the Jewish community to know, certainly for us at Temple Emanuel to know. So, Margot, we wanted to start a chance to video up congregants and hear stories from one another. And you have a story that indeed is unique and significant. So, it's broad for me just to ask you, will you start talking, please? But can you begin, for people who know the story of the kinder transport, they know the significance of that. A lot of folks don't necessarily know that that was a part of the Holocaust story and what it meant to be a refugee. How did you wind up as one of the kids of the kinder transport?
Well, I was born in Germany and Frankfurt, and the first 8 years of my life were very comfortable, very, very nice, perfect childhood with all the comforts and conveniences. And then in 1933, actually, when Hitler came to power, things started to change. Opportunities, stopped, and my father had to sell his business, and starting we had to leave schools because we had to couldn't go to secular schools. We had to go to parochial schools, so there were 2 of them in Frankfurt, and we couldn't even play with our friends anymore, because if they had talked to us or played with us, they would have even endangered their families. I mean, there was just no opportunity. You were afraid to walk the streets. You had to be careful what you said. Childhood ceased, basically. And then in 1936, when my family started to scatter and emigrate to the United States, one family went to Argentina. We were supposed to join them in Argentina, but my father became ill. And in the beginning of 1938, died. And at that point, my mother had to carry on. I had one sibling, my brother, and things became harder and harder to exist as a Jew. In fact, I just recently got information that there was a book written about my brother, and I had a page translated. In 1936, the family started to scatter, most of them to the USA. My parents decided to emigrate to Argentina. My parents sent me to learn farming at a trade school. I met the people counselors from the Chalutz movement and heard about Zionism and kibbutzim. In 1937, my father became ill with cancer. We had to give up the prospect of immigrating to Argentina. My father's illness emptied our family resources, and we had to sell jewelry and other possessions. We had to turn to the local Jewish community for help. In 1938, my father passed away. I stopped my studies and went to work helping our mother. I worked as a gardener, helping an estate of the Baron Rothschild that was not yet confiscated by the Nazis. My grandparents came to live with us after they were removed from their village. And our relatives in the USA, anyway, arranged for us to come to America, but the waiting times were so long until 1941. So, situation in Germany continued to worsen and became dire, so I signed up for Aliyah, without my mother, without telling my mother, but in the end I needed her approval. She tried to stop me, but in the end she signed. So that's what saved him, because when you went to Aliyah, you had to go to a preparatory camp. It was outside of Berlin. And on the 9th of November, that's where he was. Because Uri was 16, almost 17. They would have arrested him because they came to the house. 9th of November came, Crystal Night. And right after the 9th of November, England came and to rescue 10,000 children from Germany, Czech Republic, and Austria, which was already the occupied countries. And I was one of those children. Application was made. My brother at that point was accepted, went to Israel to Youth Aliyah, actually 6 weeks before I left Germany. And I was accepted to go on the 10,000 children camp. And they were taken by train from all over, and the trains came through, most of them came through Frankfurt, or lots of them anyway. And I remember my mother taking me to the station in April of 1939, and one of the children, and with all the other children, and started our way to England. We were allowed one suitcase, and she put the clothes I wore and a few clothes that she bought that to grow into. We could take 40 grams of silver, which in my case was 2 teaspoons in a serving spoon, and the 2 silver napkin rings were his and mine, and 10 German marks, which I don't even know what the value of that would have been then. And we were taken to England. The train took us through Holland, Hope Holland, and ferry ride, another train ride, and eventually we ended up at Liverpool Station in London. Some of us were sponsored and picked up by sponsors. Others who were not, Bloomsbury House, which was the committee responsible for those who were not, either sent them to hostels, orphanages, or farms. I had a sponsor, which was lucky for me. It saved my life. But it was not necessarily a good experience. I mean, the 5 years in England were not my greatest 5 years. But anyway, I ate with a maid in the kitchen. I did housework before and after school. And I think I was used. Today I would say I was exploited. I was 13 years old. That was in April. In September the 3rd, war broke out in Europe. And the people I lived with evacuated, except the maid and myself. They left in London to face the bombing. And the bombing started immediately after war was declared. So she and I stayed in London and made the best of it. And then in January, they decided they could not afford to keep me anymore. And Bloomsbury House took over and sent me to a hostel outside of London in Kent. It was a kind of hostel, school, orphanage. It was for Jewish girls, refugee girls. The ages ranged from 4 to 16. Actually, the Kent transport ages ranged from 3 months to 17 years. Anyway, I went to Rusthall Beacon, which was not a bad place. Some of the teachers were nice, others were not so nice, but we children had each other. And the older ones taking care of the younger ones, and there I lived for 2 years. And at that point, I've become very, very friendly with one of the girls, who I was friendly with all our lives until she passed away about 3 years ago. And we decided that we wanted to venture out. Actually, at the age of 15, I was sent to a dress shop to learn to clean and to learn how to do dressmaking. So Julie and I applied, and we got permission to go back to London. And this was in 42. There was war going on, but Julie had an aunt and uncle there, and I think that helped. And we moved into a hostel and stayed there for a little while. We found jobs and managed to support ourselves, barely, but we did. And then we decided to rent a room from a lady who was very nice, but we didn't last there very long, and we rented a little apartment. And there we lived together until I left in April of 1944 to come to the States. Life in England was not easy. There was a war going on. We barely made ends meet. We wore the same clothes most of the time because we couldn't afford anything else. But then anybody else we knew didn't have much more either, and everything was rationed. I mean, they were so limited, but you know, you get used to it. We were used to gas masks, we were used to sirens, go to the underground, go to shelter, stay home. I mean, it just became a way of life. And we were teenagers, we were young, we met boys, most of them soldiers, most of them American soldiers, and we went to dances and we enjoyed ourselves. You know, we were teenagers. Until 1944, I got a visa, a priority visa, because I had family in New York, and I left London and came to the States. It took 2 weeks to get from Liverpool to Boston. We encountered a horrendous storm on the Atlantic in April. And of course we traveled in a convoy in those days, you know, small ships. But then I came to New York. And those were the 5 years in England. I mean, they were hard, but they made me grow up quick. We managed to communicate with our mother until 1941 through Switzerland. But then in 1942, I had a postcard from my grandmother to say that my mother had gone on vacation, which I understood to say that she had been deported. Actually, we didn't find out what happened to our mother until, never did. I mean, through the years, until about 6 years ago, Lobree wasn't even alive anymore, didn't know about it. And I called we constantly were in contact with the Holocaust Museum. And I called again and a young man answered. And he said, let me check into it again, because a lot of the archives had been opened in Europe. And he emailed me exactly the date, the train, when my mother was deported on the 24th of May of 1942. And she was on a train to Auschwitz, but apparently not everybody on the train went to Auschwitz. They went through Poland, of course, and there was a train station in a place called Ispica. And it was a ghetto, and those who weren't going to Auschwitz were taken off the train and shot and just buried in mass graves. And that's the last I've heard. So that was basically the story. So then I spent 4.5 years in New York and came to San Francisco. And, you know.
I could have hit pause on your story about 40 times to peel apart any of those moments. I'm thinking about the moment at the train station as your mother is saying goodbye. I'm thinking about what it was like, what happened to the maid when you were in London, when you and Julie were figuring things out, how you went from from dances with the soldiers to bounces like this. There's so many pieces in there.
You know, again, as a child who really don't understand the severity of it, and I didn't until I was an adult. And actually, when I realized the trauma of it, that I did what I did where I was because of the Holocaust, is when I read Leon Uris's Exodus. And in it, Karen says goodbye to her father when she goes to Denmark. And at that point, I was married and I had Lindsay. And at that moment, I said to myself, could I or would I give up my child? And that's when I understood the trauma of what my mother must have gone through, sending her children away to make sure that their lives would be saved within 6 weeks of each other, knowing that she may never see them again. And that's when I became very angry, actually, for a while. I realized then her strength and her love for us. I mean, it was just indescribable. But I also realized after a while that anger is very destructive, it's not productive. And I know that if I'd asked my mother, she would have said, get over it, go on with your life. And with the good fortune and the blessing of marrying David, who really made me what I am today, I've always said that. He made me actually get my high school diploma, go back to college. And many a time I came home and said, I can't do it. I mean, I had children. Bruce was in high school already when I started. And he said, yes, you can. And he just kept pushing me. I went through with it, and I chose to become a travel agent at that point. And that's what I did for the next 40 years. But it was really David who made me, who gave me the opportunities. And when I first started, and you know, I sort of became a professional volunteer, system president, Women's League president, I mean, you know, and he helped me. He would listen to tape when I spoke, and he would listen, and he would, I mean, he was there for me, and really, I guess that he made me what I am.
That is one of the most enduring teachings that I ever hear you talk about, is that whole idea of that anger doesn't get you anywhere. And when I think of survivors and refugees, it's a teaching like what you just said that I think is so inspiring and so important.
Yeah, it's, you know, even today, I mean, you know, we all get angry at our kids, our families, our relatives. Don't hold a grudge, get over it. When it's over, let it go, because it's just so destructive. When I see people, and I know many who went through what I ever, mine was by far the least of the stories. There's so many much worse, who can't talk about it, who carry that anger, who carry that grudge. And I realize what happens to them.
Did your brother take a similar approach in terms of the disposition?
Well, Uri went to Israel. I think Uri thought he was going to a summer camp. I mean, he really never took, and he loved Israel. I mean, he became a part of Israel. I mean, he was one of the Chalutzim. He was one of the, you know, cleaned the soil area on the Dead Sea. And, you know, this is founded Cabri. He is actually, I think Uri, after the first time he came to the United States, he was here several times with Zahava. We could have convinced him to move here. Zahava would not. His wife would not have moved. I think Uri would have enjoyed some of the comforts and that we enjoyed that they did not have. But he was very happy in Israel. I mean, he was very respected, very loved, became an educator. I mean, he was just a great, great guy. And of course, lost a son. So, I mean, he, you know, really paid, you know. But all his children were in the army, all his in-laws were in the army, now his grandchildren were in the army. I mean, you know, it just became, my family in Israel today numbers about 28 from those two children that were in. So.
When you went back, can you talk for a moment about when you went back to Frankfurt?
Yes.
And they placed the plaque?
In 1990, actually, I had always said I would never go back to Frankfurt. I wasn't that wanted then. I don't want to, you know, how would they want me now? But then in 1996, I was invited as a former citizen. And I said I could only do it if Uri would come. And Uri had been invited before, but he said he would wait for me. And I said without him, I couldn't do it. Just from an emotional point of view. I mean, David understood what I went through, but it was not the same. So yes, we met in Frankfurt. And actually, I have to say, for the city of Frankfurt, a very, very generous 2 weeks. Really gave us the opportunity. And Uri and I walked our childhood. We went through every apartment we lived in. We rang the doorbells. We were invited in. I mean, really, we spoke in high schools. We were respected. When we spoke, they arranged for us for a car to take us to the village where my grandparents lived. I mean, they did everything. So then we also had the opportunity, because Murray came with his grandson who had to go back to Israel training for bar mitzvah. So we invited Lindsay to come instead. So on the Shabbat, before they were dedicating a monument in the old city of Frankfurt. Frankfurt had a very old, big Jewish tradition, community. And Uri and I decided that we would go and see that monument the day before. They were dedicating it on Sunday, because I had to go to the airport to meet Lindsay. So besides, all the speeches were in German, and David didn't understand German, and so it was just. So we went there, and it was all roped off. And this policeman came and said, "You can't come in." And with this, a young man comes out, and we told him why we were there. And he said, "Come on in." So he explained the monument to us. And then he took us. There is a 17th century Jewish cemetery in the old city of Frankfurt with 4 walls. I would say 6 feet high, maybe they're 5. I mean, to me, anything over 5 foot is tall. So there were 11,150 little brass plaques with the names of people who were victims within that community. And as we walked around, we realized they were alphabetical. And each one had the name, the date of birth, and where they went, Auschwitz, Theresienstadt, or where they died. In my mother's case, we found my mother's name. In her case, it said unknown. That was in 1996. We found my grandmother, and we found my aunt. So that's the first time we knew that my mother was actually recognized as a victim. And of course, before we knew it, there were the televisions interviewing the whole thing. That's the first time we heard about our mother. That was emotionally.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, that was quite a shock. But of course, when we went back a year and a half ago, there are now even more names on those walls, because they have since found many more names. So that was the experience of going back to Frankfurt. And we visited, it really was exciting. And then the last night, the city of Frankfurt, in the town hall, gave a farewell dinner. And there was an Israeli contingency. There were about 30, and there were about 70 others, about 100 of us from the rest of the world. And the contingency in Israel said that they were going to thank the city of Frankfurt, and the rest of the contingency came to me and said, "Would you represent us?" So I had 3 days to prepare for this, and I did it in German. And I spoke at the city hall of Frankfurt the last night that we were there. David was there, Lindsay was there. It was most exciting. And, I did that. So that was my claim to fame.
Among other things. But when you went back a couple of years ago and they did the plaque outside your home, what was that like for you and for the people around you as well?
That was a very emotional experience too, because it was a different experience. First of all, 3 of Uri's grandchildren came from Israel for the weekend. Germany, one of the artists, created a stone setting, which by now they've said thousands of them. And this was only people who allowed it. You had, not everybody wanted it done. And these are stones set in the last address where the victim was registered. In other words, not the last address where the victim lived, because they had to move and they had to go into, and in the end, actually, what the city did was put all the Jews into 1 apartment house or 2 apartment houses. They called it the Jew houses. And from there, they just picked them up. But the last address, and we said yes, of course. So this is what went on. The last address, they said 3, and I have pictures of that, 3 there was copper stones set into the sidewalk, and it tells the name, the date of birth, and where they went to, or how they succumbed. So they sent one for my mother, one for my brother, and one for me. And the only time that the artist came, who did it himself, was if there was family. So, of course, here was family. So and it's amazing because they publicize it. People from the city came, people from the buildings in the community came, and it was quiet. They have a big sign, it should never happen again, that they made quite a ceremony out of it. And Elad wrote read from, and I think Lindsay, no, I don't think Lindsay spoke, but Elad did, and anyway, it was very emotional, that whole trip. We visited all the places where, of course, we lived as children, because his grandchildren were there. Regina had never been to Germany, so this was her first experience. So we went to the cemetery, and the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Frankfurt has you go down a path, and there's a row, and there's like these niches with the stones in them. And some of them are actually family names, whole families, who committed suicide as a family if they knew they were being arrested. And of course there's the monument, the Auschwitz monument. But it was a most emotional experience, both for the 3 youngsters from Israel and for us too. And then they gave a dinner, a farewell dinner, and again I ended up being asked to say thank you, which I did. But yeah, from there we went to Berlin and visited just every monument, every the museum, and then we went to Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp. So that was the trip to Germany. You know, more so here I find, because there's, I mean, now that I've been in this for a few years, it's amazing how little is known. And when I got the statistics of high schoolers who never heard the word Holocaust, I mean, I'm sort of stunned by that. Jewish suffering came with mother's milk. I mean, you know, we've had that since the day we were born. I mean, they've always suffered. And the quenching that went on.
That's what we know.
But yeah, that's part of it. But this is a part that we've lived through.
That's
right. I mean, you know, it's one thing when you read it, and it's another thing when when you live through it.
You are someone who can tell the story because you yourself experienced it. Right. And what we fear as you age and all the other people who were in this story have aged,
Not too many hours left.
is that when there's the lack of personal connection, and that is on us. And once we have the story, it is on us to retell it as well.
When I went back to Germany, I'm not going to say that there was no anti-Semitism, but there is more of it now. And with what we are experiencing in this country, I am worried. Are we going to get to a point where I again have to look over my shoulder? Or are my children are going to experience seeing their synagogues burn like we did? So I guess I do bring that in. The importance of voting.
And when we think about responsibility is paying attention to the other. And in Hebrew, they're related. Achrayut, responsibility, and acher means other. Responsibility is taking care of and watching out for the other. And we do that whether through voting or whatever ways that means
look out for your, treat your neighbors, you treat yourself. Well, this was the page that I showed the rabbi where my parents, and here I am with my husband, and here's my son. So all this was in 1935, 30, or whatever. This was in 1996. I think this was in 2013.
Mm. And then the picture over there, that was,
And this was in 1996.
and that's Brother Uri, but that's him at his bar mitzvah.
Right. That's,
You talked about this was your grandparents' house.
yeah, this was my grandparents.
Hold on, before you flip, hold on.
You know, that used to be the synagogue.
Really?
And when the synagogue, yeah, my grandfather bought the house.
What happened to the synagogue?
They were the only Jews in that village in the end. You know.
Wow. So that was, and how old was the building? I mean, I've got it.
Oh my
pretty
God.
old.
I mean, we're going back now. I mean, it must be 150 years or more.
I would bet more.
That was the one, that's my father and my brother. And that's my brother and his grandson, the same window. And we had a sunroom. Mm-hmm. And that's Uri and I and the nanny or whatever. And this was actually in the back of this house. That was my first day at school. And then I went back to visit it in 1996. And then I went back to visit it in 2000, whatever.
Mm.